Welcome to the Lee Library. You're in for an incredible treat today. We have a wonderful show, and I have a very special guest, Cyndi Smith, who's been a lifelong resident of Lee, and who many of you know. She's an artist, she's a quilter, and she's taught many workshops, and she's taught in the schools for many years. So we have a wonderful tour that you're going to see of her quilts. So, Cyndi, welcome. Thank you for sharing your quilts with us, and thank you for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And so, would you like to tell us about how you got started in all this quilting, especially?
My mother was a quilter, and she used to ask me to go buy her fabrics. And when I would go, she'd say to me, "You can spend a little yourself." And at that time, $20 was quite a bit of fabric. So I would go pick out her fabric and buy $20 worth of fabric for myself, and then go home, help her with her quilts, do some piecing on my own, and that's how I got started.
That's great. Well, and it's led to this wonderful exhibit. So that is great. Were you quilting by hand then?
By then I was piecing by machine, but quilting by hand. And I found it a really slow process.
Oh, it is yes, very slow. But so how did you get started in making these large quilts?
10 years ago, I had oral cancer, and the treatment was really pretty bad. And when I got done, of course, you're depressed, and you discover that the treatment has made some changes in your life that you did not anticipate. And one of them was the loss of my singing voice. And I ended up speaking with a very wonderful counselor, and she said, "You will find another way to sing." And these are my songs.
It's not just singing. Each one of these is a concert in itself. You have just outshone everything. So it's just wonderful.
They just bring me great joy in the making and the process. And when I give them to people, they enjoy them, and it's amazing.
It's a lifelong gift. But each quilt is so wonderful, and each one brings so many people joy. So this has really spread. The joy that you've done in these quilts has really spread. So should we start by talking about the quilts that are behind us, because this is where it started?
This is where it started. Back in the late 70s and the 80s, when my mother was quilting, she developed what quilters call a stash, which is a lot of fabric.
Right.
There's a term, sable, stash accumulated beyond life expectancy. And the stash was larger than my mother's life expectancy, and it was left. But at that time, I wasn't quilting. I knew someone who was quilting, and I thought I would give the fabrics, and they would be used. And over time, a period of years, they weren't used, and she called me and said, "I'm going to send them to Goodwill. Would you like to come and get them?" And I said, "Yes. I don't want to sort through them. I'll just take them all." And people think that colors in fabrics, like there was 70s colors and 80s colors, that's really not true. Color has not changed. What has changed is how we combine it.
Right.
So when you take the old fabrics and you combine them with, for instance, this green is new fabric,
Right.
and the yellow green is new fabric. And that's a modern sense, that putting that yellow green in there. So these are all my mother's fabrics. This was the first one I did. This quilt is a quilt dedicated to my mother, and as I said, it contains her stash. The browns that are in that, the rusts and the browns, are older fabrics. Some of them came from the Jennifer House. Some of them came from quilt shops in Lenox that no longer exist. I think there's still a few pieces in there from the pumpkin patch.
Wow.
The pattern is a Dresden. It's a medallion quilt with a Dresden in the center, a carpenter star around it, and then the border the interior border is flying geese, and then the exterior border is a rope pattern, but I only used half of the pattern. And then I have these swirling stars in the corners.
So on the quilting now, you have fabulous quilting all over. And what are some of the patterns? Are these patterns that you have designed yourself, or are these patterns that you have put together to create your unique designs?
The feathers are very traditional patterns, and when I started quilting again, the one thing I wanted to be able to do was make a feather. It's one of these things that everyone who quilts, they want to be able to do a feather. And then I needed to find some patterns to put in the carpenter's star. So you have the feathers around the Dresden plate. And then I also did micro quilting around the Dresden plate. It's very small quilting, and it's designed to puff that center out.
It does. It makes it stand out. It's really wonderful how it does stand out.
And then the flying geese have what we call continuous curves. And then the outside border, I used a ruler to just do overlapping squares. So you see these angles following the pattern itself.
This is really, truly a wonderful tribute to your mother. And I'm so glad that she got you started in quilting, because we certainly are appreciating all you have here. So let's move now to the next quilt that's part from your mother's fabrics.
This quilt is actually another Dresden plate. And the ruler makes only 10 blades instead of the numerous blades that were in the other quilt. And these fabrics are from her stash. I added a few fabrics because the person that was made for loves bunnies, so there are bunnies in it.
Oh, wow.
And you see a lot of straight line quilting. That's done to accent the Dresden plates. And then the border, there's a rope border and some feathers tucked in because I just wanted to tuck in some feathers.
I think that artist prerogative, absolutely. This is a very popular quilt by our visitors. Everybody that sees this quilt walks in and says, oh, I remember something my grandmother had, something similar. And so this is one of the ones that's very popular.
The fabrics in it, my friend whose daughter it's been given to, knows the fabrics, and she'll say, oh, I made one girl this for a dress. I made my other daughter this for the dress. I remember we had an apron that I made.
Right.
So she knows all those fabrics, and it's really kind of fun.
It is fun. It's great. It has lots of great memories in it. So now we're going to move to the other memory quilt.
This is a Lone Star, and it's one of the quilts that quilters have on their bucket list. And I did this with instructions from a set of lessons done by Missouri Star Quilt Company for their anniversary. And I followed everything she said, and it came out, and I was very pleased.
It's absolutely perfect. It's an absolutely perfect star.
But once it came out, I had to get a background for it, because it's like, oh, now I have it. I need a background. And that is a new fabric from Tula Pink. And it contains all the colors that are in the star. And I got that from the pumpkin patch.
It's interesting because it makes a very old pattern very modern with the background fabric.
It does, yes.
It really brings all those colors out. That's a great. And I love the quilting on the all around too. That also brings the star out. So that's wonderful quilting. Now all of these three that we've looked at are all done on a long arm machine.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, they
and,
are.
So let's talk a little bit about your long arm machine. So now that you've mentioned your long arm machine, I think we need to talk a little bit about it because people aren't too familiar, or at least some people aren't too familiar. The quilters are, but people coming in were asking about the long arm machine, and so we're going to focus on yours now. And is this your first one?
This is actually my second one. I got a 16-inch handy quilter and outgrew it and realized that I needed bigger to be able to reach more at once. The space that you get to quilt has to do with the size of the machine itself. And this is a 20-inch machine, which gives me 20 inches of throat space. But as you roll the quilt up, you lose some of that throat space. So it is very important to have the bigger machine. It's actually 12 feet wide. I have, my garage is my studio, so I have plenty of room for it. And she sits there, and the tradition is with quilters and sewists to name their machines. And I wanted to name her in honor of a friend of mine who did charity quilts. He did a lot for the Shriners. He did a lot for different organizations. And I don't know how many he did, really. Danny Sullivan used to quilt them for him. But his name was Percy. And I said, I really don't want to call my machine Percy. But he was from Louisiana, and he was very proud of his ancestry. And he had 3 times grandmother that was named, and her real name, I found her birth certificate, Mississippi Ann Varnadu.
Oh, wow.
And so that machine has been dubbed Mississippi Ann Varnadu. And when she's being good, I call her Miss Ann. And when she's being bad, I say Mississippi Ann Varnadu, behave.
I can imagine, because that's a lot of quilting to do and a lot of threading and everything too. So, but that's wonderful. I love.
She's a very reliable machine.
Oh,
she really is.
That's great. So that's a wonderful story to share. Thank you. So let's look at your quilt that's right behind there, and that's the frog quilt.
Yes, and it's called the frog because I had trouble with the blocks, getting them to line up correctly, and I had to keep taking them out, which is rip it, rip it, rip it. So we call it frogging. And this thing seemed to be ill-fated from the very beginning. I designed it on EQ8, which is a program to design quilts, and I did everything, the colors and everything. Went on the shop hop, matched up all the colors, and to me it just never got the life. It never spoke to me the way my other quilts do. But it's growing on me. Seeing it here, I think it's growing on me.
I think the lighting helps it, and I think yes. But you've had such a struggle with it, and I think that could be why it's taking a lot longer to grow on you. But it's a wonderful quilt, and it is really fun to see. Now this next quilt is also a very popular quilt, and this is your bee quilt. And would you like to tell us how you were inspired to do this quilt?
Well, this was a class. It's a Laura Heine pattern. It was a class down at the pumpkin patch. And once I made the bee, I felt he needed a flower. And one of the fabric companies produces these giant flowers. And I said it was perfect. And because I was learning to use my long arm, I decided to try to do every petal differently, so it would become like a primer of what I would do later on with the machine. So that was one of the early ones I did on the machine, and I had a lot of fun doing the quilting. It
looks like it's a lot of fun, but it's wonderful because each petal is so different, and that does make it stand out. But I also love the bee with all its different fabrics and the sayings in the fabrics, and especially the blessings. This is really a fabulous quilt as well.
It was a lot of fun to do all that and find all those things and include little thoughts that are kind of subtle, and if you read it, it almost invites you in.
Okay, so we're going to look at Lancaster Whirlwind, okay?
The block in there is a modern block from Deb Tucker's Studio 180, and it's called her Cyclone block. So that's where it got its name. And initially, I fell in love with Amish quilts, and I think as you look, you'll see the Amish influence. And this is done in Amish colors, but it is a modern block. And I try to do that. I try to work with what is old in patterns and yet give it some sort of a modern twist. And I think this does it pretty well.
I think that that's exactly right. So, and you mentioned that this was featured on Linda's Electric Quilters YouTube channel?
Yes. They asked people to send pictures of quilts that they had learned how to do a pattern from their show. And I was having difficulty doing those spirals because I was going the wrong way in them, which is part of the problem with the frog going the wrong way. Do you see a pattern there?
Yeah.
And I watched his mother learn to do it, and all of a sudden it clicked with me and sent it in. And it was really funny because the young man that does the YouTube videos along with his mother looked at it and just said, "That is gorgeous."
Right.
And I don't think there's higher praise than to have another quilter say, "You did well."
Absolutely. And now we have another Amish-inspired quilt, but a very special quilt, and it's titled From Sawdust to Stardust. So let's hear about this quilt.
This quilt is a carpenter star. I wanted to do something dedicated to my father, who was a carpenter and a sawyer. He actually built the home that I live in. And I just wanted something that would be special to him. And this is, as you said, Amish inspired. It's some of my early quilting. I think if I went back and did it, I probably would make some changes. But there's a border there where the black and the blue meet. The border is hearts and teardrops. And I thought that was very...
it's very appropriate.
Very appropriate to it. And one thing I did try to do with this, the center of the quilt has a blue that is slightly lighter than the blue that surrounds the carpenter star, which is slightly lighter than the blue that is in the border, with the idea being to make the quilt glow from the center. And with your lighting, it definitely works.
It did. It glows, and it has a wonderful tribute on the back of it as well.
Yes.
And it has your dad's picture on the back of this quilt.
With his sawmill.
Right.
He bought a sawmill when he was 88 years old.
Oh my gosh.
And,
wow.
And assembled it.
Oh
It came in
goodness.
pieces.
Wow.
And then proceeded to saw the biggest logs he could possibly imagine getting into it. So when I bought my long arm, I thought, I'm doing something big earlier than he did, but
But
the
I think
same
you
idea.
have the genes.
Oh, yes.
I think you have those genes to tackle big projects no matter what age, no matter what the project, and look at these wonderful results. The next quilt is called Amish Grandmother, and the name of this traditional block is Grandmother's Favorite. So let's look at this one now carefully.
It's not exactly Grandmother's Favorite because, and here's the continuing theme, I turned some of the blocks some of the pieces a different way, and it is a neat quilt, but not if someone is a real aficionado of the quilting, they'll say, oh, that's not Grandmother's favorite. It's something quite different, and it is. The fabrics in it are ombre fabrics, and I wanted to play with them. It was something that I saw and said, I'd like to see what you can do with this. So I tried to keep the light fabrics together and the darks, so they shaded. And once again, I was looking for that glowing in the blocks.
And you do see that glowing, and it goes from block to block. There's a lot of movement in this quilt, and a lot of movement in those blocks, and especially with the centers, with the quilting in the centers.
And that was something I did that was different, because instead of quilting it in black and letting the quilting kind of fade into it, as you'll see in another quilt, that I wanted the quilting to come out. So I used a colored thread, and it does do that.
Was this a variegated thread or just one color? Because
just one color.
But it seems to pick up the colors of the
Yes,
block.
some of the threads are really amazing like that. They seem to color shift, and this one does. But it's actually it actually matches one of the rose colors that's in the quilt.
What does it says that this is ruler and free motion quilting? What does ruler quilt? What do you saying when you say ruler quilting?
We have heavy plexiglass acrylic rulers that you put against the foot on the machine. And this is a machine that will do 1,800 stitches a minute.
Oh my gosh.
So
wow.
you have to really learn to do it and observe safety around it. But you can make perfectly straight lines with it. Or you can make absolutely true curves. So every curve will be the same. And that's very useful, for instance, in the circles.
Right.
It's very useful. And the straight lines, all of those straight lines were done with rulers. And the cable between the two borders, between the red border and the black inside, that cable is done with a ruler as well.
This next quilt is related to the one that we just looked at, and this one is called barred.
It's related because of the fabrics. And once again, I was playing with the ombre fabrics. I still have a little bit left, but I have played with them to the point where I've used them all up. I love what they do. I love the glow you get. This is, in one way, a very traditional quilt. It's Amish bars in the center, absolutely traditional. The corner blocks, the borders, all of that's traditional, but the way the pattern is laid out in the bars is called a French braid. And that is something that would not be done in the community at all. So that's why it's barred, because it has bars on it, and because I like puns, it would be barred and not allowed.
But this beautiful, and the quilting, this like a semicircular quilting that goes through with the feathers, with those feathers, that is just beautiful quilting.
And that is all what we call free motion, which means you just do it.
Right. And that's a challenge.
It is, but it's also the joy. I mean, it is like drawing with this great big machine, and that's fun. It is fun.
It's like Zen, though, when you're doing it.
It is.
You get into that routine of just moving things along.
Oh,
it's
you
great.
definitely do get into a zone. And this was also turned to be quilted. Instead of quilting it from top to bottom, I turned it so that I was quilting across the quilt. And that made doing the feathers much easier. Because once again, you have that throat space.
Right, right.
This quilt was exhibited at the fair, the fall fair at Hancock Shaker Village. It was the first one that I ever took to the village. And when I walked in to the room where they were doing the exhibit before they'd hung the quilts, I saw a large brick wall, and I said, in the best of all worlds, my quilt will be over there. And it was.
Oh, that was the best
because
of
when
all
it's
worlds.
seen from a distance, it really, it needs that distance to get the effect of it. But this was actually quilted on my domestic machine.
Oh, okay.
And it is one of the reasons I bought the long arm, because I began to realize that it takes a lot of physical effort to quilt on a domestic. And my shoulders I knew I would not be able to do everything I wanted to do. So I saw the long arm and tried it, and the rest is history.
Yes, the rest is history. So on this quilt, it must have been pretty exciting when you walked into the Shaker Village to see it hanging.
Oh, there are no words.
There
are no words. And to see it was up over the stairs. You were seeing it from quite a distance, and that is, for that quilt, that is the impact.
Have you had other quilts exhibited there?
Yes. My father's quilt was exhibited there, and the bee.
Oh, okay.
And there was another quilt that I exhibited that year, but that was given to a friend of mine.
Next quilt is called Strawberry Fields Forever, and this was done during a year that Cyndi made 3 red quilts. So this is the first of them, and you want to talk about this one?
This was, I saw this on Pat Sloan's YouTube, and I said, I have to make that quilt. And there was no more logic to it than that, except I just said, I have to make that quilt. And I went into my red stash and used a lot of the red stash for this and made the quilt. And it was just fun. It makes me smile. It may find a home later on. I don't know, but
it's a very happy quilt.
It is a happy
quilt. And when you walk in and you see this quilt, you do smile, because it is very cheerful and very happy. And we're going to look at the other ones that are part of this red series. This is now the second of the red series, and this one's called Applejack. And this is another very fun quilt.
This is a pattern by Lori Holt. And what I really love about this is she threw in the apple cores.
I love the apple cores. I think that makes the whole, that gives it to another level.
It really does. Mm-hmm. And she's a master of doing kind of country things, farm things, mm-hmm. Vintage. So this was her pattern, and then I used my colors in it. And once again, went into that red stash, which was beginning to get a little thinner.
Uh-huh, yes.
That's why we have some green apples in there, but there are green apples and yellow apples.
Favorites, yes, uh-huh. But it gives it a wonderful country flavor to the whole quilt. And another very happy quilt, another quilt that makes you smile.
And this is quilted what we call edge to edge. Mm-hmm. It's not custom quilted like the other quilts we've seen. And it is done with a pantograph, a piece of paper on the back of the machine, and you follow it with a laser light. Mm-hmm. And it is apples and leaves and branches.
Oh, neat. Mm-hmm.
And one of the favorite pandals I've ever done. I would like to use it again on something.
Oh, that's a nice pattern. You want to tell us a little bit about whether quilts are hung or whether they're used and how they differ?
A quilt that's going to be used on a daily basis is usually not as heavily quilted. For instance, my mother's quilt is very heavily quilted. And when you lift it, there's a great deal of weight there.
It is a great deal of weight. When we hung that quilt, we knew it's very heavy, yes.
But this quilt is quilted loosely enough so that it would be very usable. So when you go to quilt something, you need to think, am I going to use this, or is it going to be something that will be displayed?
This next quilt is called Open Options Challenge, and it's just a beautiful quilt, and it's part of the Red series, and so let's talk about this one.
This was a challenge by one of the Handy Quilter national educators, and he had found this pattern and asked people to try and make it, and it can be arranged. It's called Open Options because you can arrange it dozens of ways, and this is just one way. I wanted to go from a dark weighted fabric to the light fabrics, and as you can see, the blocks actually reverse. The dark fabrics have light around them, and the light have the dark. But when he got ready to quilt it, he does a lot with the computer-driven system on the Handy Quilter. And I don't have a computer, but I love the pattern he was using. So I decided that I was going to free motion that pattern.
Wow, wow.
And what I discovered was because I don't have to set up to do each block, because each block is slightly different. The measurements are off, and a computer, you have to accommodate the computer because it wants to be perfectly accurate. But I can just, scooch it a little bit and make it a tiny bit bigger or a tiny bit smaller, or make a feather go into a corner and fill it up. And I think I had an easier time quilting it free motion than they actually had doing it with their computers.
This is really lovely. Did you audition several ways of putting it together before you did that?
Yes, I did.
Decided on this way?
I have a design wall, and I had it up on the design wall, and I finally decided I really wanted it to transition from dark to light, which makes it really quite modern.
It does. I love the taupe in it, too. It
I do,
almost
too.
make it like Asian in that. And the Asian with the reds and the taupe color, too.
Yes.
It gives a slight Asian feel on that as well. So it's really an absolutely stunning quilt. The next quilt is called Crossroads, and we'll give you a little information on this quilt.
This is another quilt that I saw Pat Sloan making, and I love these colors, and I fell in love with the combination of the purple color and the gold color. I just thought that was stunning. And I said, I have to make this quilt. Only the fabric had not been released to the public. She had pre-auditioned pieces that they had sent to her to work with. And it was done on Jelly Roll Day. And I just waited and finally found the fabric and had the quilt together in about 2 days.
Wow. Oh, my gosh.
It's a very simple quilt to make, but I really love it. And as I said, I just love the colors in it. I think they're happy and pleasant. And the pattern, the fabric itself, I think is something, there's a title about a garden or something like that, but it's, I don't know, it's just
Wild
my
meadow.
colors.
Yes, it's
Wild meadow,
Yes,
yes.
it is. It's absolutely lovely. Now we're coming to my favorite quilt, and this one's called Facing East. And this is a traditional log cabin pattern, and we'll let you talk about it.
You've been in love with this quilt
I
for
have
several years,
Yes.
haven't you?
It had appeared in another quilt show, and I loved it. I love the story behind it, and but I love the quilt.
It's inspired by the logs that are put together to create Navajo Hogan. And the Hogan door faces east, and that's where it gets its title. And then in the center of the Hogan, there is a hole for the smoke to go through, really kind of like a skylight almost. And I wanted to put the desert sky in it. And once again, the ombre fabrics have come back to create the illusion of a sky that is shifting colors during the day. And it's my favorite colors. I had some difficulty getting all those peaches. I had a friend who was out shopping one day and saw some fabric and said, yes, this is what she's looking for.
It's perfect.
And bought it, and really marvelous. So
this is an absolutely beautiful quilt. The next one is called Here Comes the Sun, and this has special meaning for you.
Well, it does, because I get up very early in the morning, and I don't overheat my house in the winter. So when you get up in the morning, it can be quite cold. And I was kind of shivering and sitting with my feet up, trying to stay a little bit warm. And I was watching Tula Pink, and she has two younger sisters who come and visit her. And they came one day and they said, well, Mom's house is not this cold. And she said, look, girls, anyone who's cold in a house full of quilts is a fool.
Yeah.
And I thought, you are a fool. And I set out and I made, it's another log cabin. This is laid out in a different pattern. That's the fun thing about log cabin.
Absolutely.
You can do so much with it. And it's loosely quilted, so it's a nice cuddle quilt. It's been laundered, and just, it's my quilt.
And it's the best way to start the day, wrapped
It
up
is.
in it.
Here comes the sun.
Here comes the sun. Okay, and now we have Cobblestone Road, and this is a Boston Commons quilt.
I have seen Boston Commons quilts and have wanted to make them. But when you read the instructions for them, they are mind-boggling, because you have this piece and that piece and this angle, and this is Seminole pieced, and then this corner's done this way, and it's like, oh, I cannot do it. And I was watching a video with a woman who goes by the name Opinionated Quilter, and she said, it's ridiculous. All of this is blocks on point. And the minute she said it, I'm like, it is. And you do fabric strips of all the colors, and then you lay them out, and some of them you take out of the pattern and save them for another area in the quilt. So there's nothing wasted. She's a phenomenal idea. I did not believe it could work. I used some older fabric from my stash. Some of my mom's fabric is in there. That red that borders it and runs through the center of the braid is her fabric. And I have grown to love this quilt.
This is beautiful. And there's some calf facet shot cotton
Yes.
in there as well.
Yes, there is.
And this again is ruler and free motion quilting.
Yes.
And this is a fabulous quilt. I can see why you love this. And this is this the last one you've done in this group?
This is the most recent, yes.
Okay. Now we have a hug in the year of COVID. I think we all needed a hug in the year of COVID. So let's hear about this one.
This is another one of those quilts that you put on your bucket list. It is a hunter star quilt. And it's not complicated, but you have to be very accurate with it. And this pattern in particular, Deb Tucker shows the layout for the hunter star. And I wanted the field in the center to be light with the stars, and then the dark pieces all around it, and then bordered it. This is one I discovered that I loved Kim Deal fabric, and she's now become an addiction. And this I made for a friend of mine that I've known for over 40 years and worked with for a long time. And it was literally a hug in the year of COVID when you couldn't hug people.
Right.
You could send them a quilt, and
That's
that was
true.
a hug.
That's a great hug. The next quilt is called Remembering Yukika. And do you want to talk about Yukika?
Those are people who know me know that I have done Ukrainian eggs for a number of years. And we did an international swap one year, and I received an egg from a woman in Japan whose name was Yukika. And I wrote to her, or I texted her and thanked her for the egg and everything about it. And I said how beautiful her name was. I thought it was just lovely. And she said, no, my name is very silly. It means fragrance of snow. And I wrote back to her and I said, I live in New England, and when snow is coming, there is a fragrance in the air. Snow does have a fragrance, and I will think of you every time it snows. And I still do. Yukika passed from cancer in 2018, and very sad and a great loss. And she was a quilter as well.
Oh, wow. That was very nice. And these colors are reproduction shibori fabrics?
Yes, and inspired by Imari pottery, which has the orange. So the orange and the blue together, and then it's quilted with Japanese motifs.
And has ginkgo leaves in it too?
Yes.
In the quilting?
Yes, there's ginkgo leaves in the quilting.
The next piece is called Just a Tree Skirt, but this certainly isn't just a tree skirt. It's very special. So do you want to tell us about it?
This also belongs to the lady that owns the Hunter Star, the hug quilt. And this was, they had bought a tree from one of those wonderful online, and I thought, well, you need a tree skirt for Christmas.
Right.
And I made this, and it just shows that a quilt does not have to be a quilt. It can be many things, tree skirts, bed runners, a table runner, even a tablecloth. Some of my quilts spend a lot of time on my dining room table.
That's very nice. And our last piece is a Christmas quilt, and this is done in flannel fabric.
This was a quilt that Susan had hanging at the pumpkin patch, and I fell in love with it and said, I have to make one. And I had been given a lot of gift certificates for Christmas. Everybody knows what to give me. And I said, I'm going to take my gift certificates and buy the kit to make this quilt. She had it all combined so that you could put it together. The center is a panel. And what I did on the panel was I quilted the panel to go with all of the shapes. So I tried to add some dimension to it. And what I did different with this is the outside of the quilt is a paper panto. And I put marks on the pantograph where the center would be. And that's all quilted with Christmas lights and Christmas trees. And then the center is quilted entirely free motion.
That's really a neat quilt. I love the center that says, it's the most wonderful time of the year. Well, for these quilts, it's the perfect time of the year. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Cyndi. This has been an extraordinary exhibit. It's extraordinary work. It's gorgeous, as the quilters say. And everybody has just enjoyed it so much. It's just been wonderful.
It's been such an honor for me. And it's been, when we put it up, I was astounded because this is a view of quilts that you don't get to see. Right. You put them on a bed and you're looking kind of down at them. You never get to see the whole thing. It's just been an amazing honor and an opportunity. And I want to thank you for maintaining this and allowing the public to put exhibits up and enjoy it. I think
really wonderful for the community. I love having the community see how talented people are in the area and sharing all their work with us. It's just a really wonderful, positive thing for our community. And you've just made this, you brought it to a new level. And I'm so glad that we could see your quilts all hanging and all together, which makes it very special indeed.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.